I invite you today to go through John chapter 20, verses 19 to 23. It contains the appearance of the risen Jesus to the disciples when they are gathered in the upper room. The situation is bleak. The situation is sad. The situation is heavy with fear and sorrow. John is very clear that as the disciples are gathered in the room, the doors are closed for fear of the Jews. And while fear is a hindrance to encountering Jesus, Jesus can make himself available to us. Jesus can reveal himself to us, even in our fear. Closed doors are not a hindrance for the risen Jesus. Closed doors are not an obstacle for Jesus to come in. And even as the doors are closed, and even as there is fear, Jesus comes and stands in our midst. And the disciples see the risen Lord, and the disciples are filled with joy. The disciples recognize that it is the Lord. Jesus is the same, and yet he is different. Jesus is the historical Jesus and is the Christ of faith. Jesus is the Jesus who walked and lived and ate and drank in first century Palestine. And he is also the risen Lord who is available at all times. This is the Jesus who stands before his disciples. And even as he stands before his disciples, he issues them a love command by gifting them, not wishing them, but gifting them the gift of peace. Those are the first words of the risen Jesus to the disciples when they are gathered together. Peace be with you. The English word peace, unfortunately, might be spelled P-I-E-C-E or P-E-A-C-E. And P-I-E-C-E means a separation, a break. But that is not what peace means. The Hebrew word for peace is shalom. And even as you listen to this word shalom, you would realize that it is a word which communicates wholeness. So the peace which Jesus gifts his disciples is a peace that has to do with wholeness and is concerned with every single area of their lives. It is not merely spiritual. It is not merely psychological. It's not merely intellectual, but it is a very practical and tangible and material peace as well. Peace be with you. And even as he says it, he shows them his hands and his side. What is the significance of showing them his hands and his side? It is to communicate the continuity, the relevance, the movement forward of the Christ who was crucified, who is now the risen Christ. It was to communicate to them in their fear, in their sorrow, that that obstacles, that hindrances, that problems, that challenges, that the difficulty that you are going through at this moment in your life, the challenge you are experiencing now is not the end. Even in your challenge, even in your difficulty, even at this trying time in your life, like in the life of Jesus, there is hope. There is a movement forward. You will overcome like Jesus overcame. So the revelation of his hands and his side is in order to motivate the disciples to realize that it is, on the one hand, the same Jesus who suffered and died, the same Jesus who was crucified on the cross, and yet a Jesus whom death could not contain, whom the trial could not overcome, whom the temptation could not subdue, a Jesus who was able to move beyond, and a Jesus who invites them to move beyond. A second time, Jesus gifts them peace, but when he gives them peace a second time, he also issues a challenge. He also issues a command. He also issues a mission to the disciples. And the mission is to forgive and to retain sin. This has nothing to do with the sacrament of reconciliation. This has nothing to do only with the priest, because this command, this mission is issued to all disciples, and especially to you who are listening to me today. Forgive and retain sin. And in order to do this, Jesus breathes on them. The Greek verb emphusao, which is used here by John, is used only here and in Genesis chapter 1, in which God breathes life into the first human beings. There is therefore a similarity, a coherence, a correspondence, a coming together of the breath of God into first humans and the breath of Jesus into the disciples. If the breath of God made the first human alive, the breath of Jesus is giving the disciples a new life. So it is with this breath of God, it is with this Spirit of God that you are called to retain and forgive sin. What does this mean? This means that like Jesus stood as a mirror before people, like Jesus stood as a model before people, like Jesus stood as an example before people, so that people who saw him realized how far away they were from God, that people who saw him realized how they could get closer and closer and closer to God. So also, people who look at the disciples must be able to realize how far away they are from God and how they can get closer and closer and closer to God. The forgiveness and retention of sin must be that the disciples must be that mirror in which people will see their reflections. The disciples must be that model and example and inspiration which will move people towards God after having realized how far away they are from God. The disciples must be those about whom others will say, Who are you that you do these things and that you do them in this way? Who are you that you do these things and that you do them in this way? In your workplace, the manner in which you approach your work. In your neighborhood, the manner in which you are a neighbor. And wherever you go, if people can look at you and say, who are you that you do these things and that you do them in this way, then you will have fulfilled the mission of Jesus. So the love command, the mission command of Jesus is that we have to be a continuous reflection of who Jesus was. Today, the Lord cannot be present historically as He was 2,000 years ago. Today, we can only experience the Christ of faith. Today, we can only experience the Christ whom you and I will reveal to people. Will you be today one of those about whom people say, who are you that you do these things and that you do them in this way? Will you be able to say today, like Paul says in Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives